A hand pressed a wax seal onto parchment covered in old script. A voice announced that the engagement to Archduke Voldrova had been decided. In a sunlit study, a head of the household sat behind a heavy desk. He told the young man standing before him that he understood exactly what this news meant. The young man's name was Ferda Roznova, and the weight in his eyes reflected the years already carved into him. Everyone else in the room already understood what an engagement to the Archduke truly represented. For any noble, those words carried the same weight as a death sentence. Only two paths remained: refuse the engagement and be cast out of the family forever, or accept it and be destroyed piece by piece. A quiet voice inside him pushed back against both outcomes. He had never wanted power or glory. He had only wanted to belong to the family that raised him. He was known as the sickly, illegitimate third son of a knightly house. Servants watched him train alone in the courtyard, whispering that his effort meant nothing without talent behind it. No one ever stood beside him. Yet he kept enduring the silence and the sweat. He kept trying and trying again, sword after sword, day after day, refusing to stop. Our relative watched him from a window, an unreadable smile settling across his face. Despite the exhaustion, Ferda held on to a fragile hope that one day his effort would finally be acknowledged. A cousin, sword slung over his shoulder, mocked him outright, calling the idea of Ferda pursuing knighthood something close to madness. The blow that followed left Ferda crumpled against a shattered wall, told plainly that he never had the right to dream that way in the first place. Another voice spat at him, calling him nothing more than a filthy blue-eyed bastard, the insult burning deeper than any wound. Still he clung to one wish, to be accepted as family, even as he watched the others walk away without him. But behind those quiet windows, the truth remained unspoken and unchanged. Kneeling alone in the dark, Ferda understood that their eyes had turned away from him long before he ever noticed. Standing before the head of the family once more, he finally said the words aloud. He would leave the family for good. The Archduke studied him for a long moment, then answered with a single quiet word, "Very well." He stood alone at the gates he had once called home, a single bag slung over his shoulder and nowhere left to go. A voice above the gates declared that he was no longer a Roznova, the estate glowing behind him under a bruised evening sky. A trembling hand reached out toward nothing, carrying the memory of how hard he had tried, despite the man who never once looked back. Something inside him snapped. He would not forgive the man who cast him aside. A crimson magic circle roared to life around him, raw power tearing through the air that night. Walking away from everything he knew, he became a mage. He had awakened his power at 18, far later than anyone thought possible. Fellow trainees mocked him openly, certain that someone his age had no business chasing magic at all. Others sneered that he would need decades just to grasp the basics, doubting he even had the mind for it. He answered that he didn't care whether he understood it or not, and unleashed a surge of mana that left the mockers frozen in shock. A red circle bloomed beneath him, a circle fed by nothing but hatred and the need for revenge. The stronger his hatred grew, the stronger he became, until the bodies of those who wronged him lay scattered around him. After clawing his way to the sixth circle through vengeance alone, only one place remained for him to return to Roznova, his home. He turned the servants who once mocked him against each other, forcing them to kill one another. Next, he set the eldest and second sons against each other until they destroyed one another completely. At last he faced his father, the man he hated above all else, who could only beg to be killed. He refused to grant a quick end, telling his father to look closely at what had become of the proud Roznova family he built. His father broke completely, staring out through shattered glass at the ruins surrounding him, bodies scattered across the floor. Just like that, everything tied to the Roznova name vanished from the world. Yet, even after all of it, something in him whispered that none of it had been enough. Word of the massacre spread across the continent. Countless powerful warriors rose to stop him, condemning him for wiping out his own family and slaughtering anyone who stood in his way, naming him a public enemy who had to be brought to justice. He survived the onslaught once more, walking away from a hall littered with bodies, and reached the eighth circle, the highest realm any human had ever attained. He had become an archmage, yet the hatred aimed at him never faded. He knew they would come for revenge eventually, just as he once had. Determined to become strong enough to crush anyone who came for him, he set his sights on the ninth circle, the realm of a demigod, and buried himself in forbidden texts searching for the path there. The final ingredient needed to reach that realm turned out to be a dragon's heart, drawn in blood-stained detail across the page before him. A dagger plunged straight through the sketch of the beast, as he wondered aloud whether fate was mocking him with a cruel joke. The dragon he needed was the red dragon, Archduke Valdrova. Her heart was the price of his ascension. Under a pale double moon, he climbed toward her mountain lair, fate twisting the path ahead of him. Blood pooled across ancient stone as massive jaws opened before him. The dragon spoke, calling out the irony that the very person meant to be her fiancé had come for her life instead. She had never expected the one bound to her by engagement would be the one to end her, bloodied and snarling. He told her to die quietly by his hands, naming her a tyrant. She admitted she knew people called her a tyrant, but asked him plainly why he believed it. She reminded him she had never once shown herself, not even before his birth, staying hidden from the human world entirely, and asked what grudge he could possibly hold against her. He snapped back, demanding to know if she thought he had suffered for nothing. He accused her of ruining his life, claiming her pointless search for a fiancé was the very reason his own family cast him out. She asked if that was truly her fault. He screamed back that it was. He raged that a savage dragon daring to want a human as her mate was the greed that destroyed his life, demanding she understand the weight of what she had done. Her claw scraped softly against the stone as she murmured that she understood now. He steadied himself, wondering what strange thing had just passed between them, deciding it didn't matter as long as it bought him time to gather his mana for one final strike. The dragon rose to her full height, declaring that she finally understood as he stood small before her, ready to strike. A massive claw slammed down toward him with terrifying speed. Caught inside a burning magic circle, he cried out in pain as the spell tore through him. Blood streamed from his eye as he pressed forward, refusing to stop despite the damage his own body was taking. He drove his hand deep into her chest, tearing through scale and muscle, as she reeled back in shock. He watched blood pour down the rocks and wondered why she had wounded herself instead of fighting back. He asked her directly, recalling that she had once said his magic required a dragon's heart to reach the ninth circle. A voice in his mind snarled that she was trying to destroy her own heart before he could take it. He screamed at her to stop as light exploded from within her chest. He forced his hand deeper, refusing to let this last chance at the ninth circle slip away from him. The dragon roared in agony as fire burst around them, and he cursed her for continuing to resist, even now. Light and sparks tore through the air as the struggle between them reached its peak. He cried out in denial, terrified the heart had been destroyed just as he was about to claim it. To his disbelief, the heart remained whole and glowing in his hands. A voice offered it to him plainly. "Take it." He stood frozen, staring at the heart in silence, unable to understand why she would let this happen. He asked her directly why she had gone this far, pointing out that if this had truly been her last stand, she could have killed him instead. She admitted she knew, saying simply that her own existence had made him miserable, and that was reason enough. She confessed she had hated herself for a long time. She said she despised the violent blood running through her own veins. The urge to rage and destroy without reason had always lived inside her, clawing for release. A monstrous eye tore open behind him, unleashing the unstoppable version of himself as flames swallowed the streets and terrified bystanders scattered from his path. Even in memory, she recalled how her very presence had always frightened people. Everything would have ended peacefully had she simply died, and yet some part of her still longed for happiness while she lived. She admitted her foolish dream had caused too many people to suffer. Since everyone around her had grown miserable because of her existence, she hoped he could at least find happiness through what she was about to give him. It was the last thing she could offer. A silhouette of a great dragon curled protectively around a small hooded figure standing beside her. He staggered, gripping his chest, confused by the strange feeling rising inside him. He grimaced, unable to explain why the moment left such a bitter taste in his mouth. He cursed her name, accusing the damned beast of trying to worm her way into his mind even now, warning himself not to fall for it and to remember why he had come. Standing before her massive form, he told himself that opening the ninth circle was finally within reach. He lifted her heart high overhead, the glowing essence of a dragon who had lived for eternity. He wondered what would happen if he absorbed it completely. Light poured from his throat as he screamed that he would surpass humanity itself. The explosion of power consumed him entirely, promising rebirth as a demigod. A glowing silhouette floated in the void, murmuring in confusion at what was happening to him. Suspended in light, he confirmed to himself that he had indeed consumed the dragon's heart. Yet it felt like sinking into a bottomless swamp, dragging him down into darkness. A clawed hand reached toward the falling light, as he wondered whether this overwhelming flood of emotion was a side effect of consuming the heart. Lightning cracked across his vision as he realized with shock that what he was seeing might be Valdrova's own memories. He collapsed to the ground gasping, finally understanding what he had truly witnessed. In the void beyond death, Ferda drifted through a swirling storm of light, sensing the last emotion the dragon, Valdrova had felt an ancient despair so vast it dwarfed his own suffering. Within that same collapse he felt something else buried beneath her pain, a quiet loneliness that had wanted, until its final moment, to hold the whole world close. Ferda woke gasping, soaked and trembling, gripped by the horrifying realization of how small his hatred and vengeance truly were next to what he had taken from her. He could only ask himself what he had done. Floating above his own faded memory, he watched a small boy sketching quietly by a window and wondered what he had actually been chasing his whole life: power, revenge, or godhood. The answer came instantly. None of that was ever the real goal. The boy pressed crayon to paper, drawing a crooked, colorful picture of a family standing together, smiling. All he had ever wanted was that simple family and a peaceful life. A ghostly figure of his older self looked back at the child he once was. His mind turned to Valdrova, gazing out through a castle window into an open sky, her horns and crimson hair catching the light. He wondered if she had wished for that same simple peace, bloodied and hollow. He confessed to himself that everything he had built, the power, the title, the war, had been meaningless. He stood over her lifeless body on the cold stone streets, her red hair pooling around her, and asked what any of it mattered now that she was already gone by his own hand. Tears cut through the blood on his face, his eyes hollow with grief and disbelief at what he'd become. Deep in that memory, an ancient truth surfaced: only a mage who had reached the 9th circle could cast the one spell strong enough to undo it all. A wish, kneeling inside a blazing magic circle, he unleashed everything he had left, even as a numb voice inside him whispered that it was already meaningless. A voice called his name, Ferda, snapping him back into consciousness with a jolt. Disoriented, he found himself somewhere achingly familiar, sitting across from a man behind a grand desk, unsure where or when he was. His father snapped at him for zoning out, demanding his attention. Ferda immediately recognized the name on the documents before him. Arambalt Roznova. A flicker of memory surfaced. The man across from him had died broken and alone. Then it hit him. This was that day. His father announced that his engagement to Archduke Valdrova had officially been arranged. His father added coldly that Ferda surely understood exactly what that meant for the family, and that refusing the engagement would bring consequences too severe for the family to bear, leaving Ferda to decide, this time, what he would do differently. As his foot pressed onto solid ground, Ferda confirmed it. He had truly returned to the past. Facing his father's stunned reaction, he answered simply that he understood, his back straight, giving nothing away. With Valdrova's image looming behind him, Ferda declared he wouldn't run from her again, formally accepting the engagement. Word spread fast through the Roznova estate. Hukin, the second son, stopped mid-step as a maid helped him with his coat, stunned that Ferda had actually agreed to the engagement with Duke Valdrovas. Servants whispered among themselves in the hallway, unable to make sense of it. One recalled seeing Ferda begging for his life earlier, yet insisted he wasn't the type to walk willingly into a death trap. Another asked what he was doing now. A servant reported that Ferda was set to depart soon, but had dismissed everyone and shut himself in his room alone. Hukin grinned at the news, deciding there was still time for one last brotherly chat. He suggested they go see just how miserable Ferda looked before leaving. Hukin burst through the door without knocking, shouting Ferda's name and demanding to know why he hadn't left yet. He froze. Ferda stood calm in front of a mirror, dressed and composed, nothing like the broken mess Hukin expected to find, crying and begging to get out of the engagement. Ferda glanced over, unfazed by the intrusion, and asked dryly what he was supposed to do with a brother who barged in without knocking. Hukin pointed out that he'd told the servants to stay outside on purpose. Ferda replied plainly that he was dressing himself, and that he wouldn't be getting help from anyone from now on. He needed to get used to it. Hukin laughed under his breath, unsettled by how different this Ferda sounded from the one he remembered. He asked if Ferda understood what it actually meant now that the engagement was finalized. Ferda answered without hesitation. It meant getting the hell out of the family, didn't it? Hukin's smile cracked into panic. That wasn't what he meant. He meant Ferda would die if he went through with it, and asked whether Ferda even knew why the position of the Duke's fiancée had stayed empty for so long. Ferda lowered his gaze and answered quietly that he was well aware. The story turned back to the past. Valdrova's first fiancé had been the Empire's third prince. He'd been the perfect man, brilliant, striking, adored by the people. He'd even turned down the throne itself just to volunteer as the tyrant dragon's fiancé. All that stood before the towering red dragon was one small, determined figure stepping forward into her shadow. On day after arriving for the engagement, the prince knelt in the dark, hands clasped, his expression full of dread rather than hope. What followed wasn't mercy. He was beaten to a bloody pulp. Despite that fate, Hukin shoved a finger toward Ferda's chest, demanding to know if he really believed he could survive an engagement that had broken even the third prince. Ferda waved him off, indifferent, calling himself no one to stop an idiot who wanted to march willingly into a dragon's jaws. Hukin's tone turned cold. He warned Ferda never to think about defying the family and running if he tried. Hukin would sever his head himself before Valdrova ever got the chance. Hukin's eyes narrowed as he called out to his brother, cutting straight to it. He warned him to keep it in his pants. He accused Ferda outright, telling him everyone had noticed the way he stared at their eldest brother's wife. Ferda's face twisted in disbelief at the accusation. Hukin lunged forward in a rage, calling him a little bastard only for Ferda to raise a hand and stop him cold, warning him to hold back. Ferda reminded him that his face had grown valuable now, unlike when he was a child, and a bruise simply wouldn't do. With that, he announced it was a long journey to the dragon's jaws, and he'd be taking his leave. A carriage waited outside the gates as Ferda walked toward it, suitcase in hand, ready to depart. The family's old butler wept, telling him it had been an absolute honor serving him all these years. Ferda's expression stayed distant as he thought to himself that the man was spouting lies he didn't even mean. If it had really been an honor, he wouldn't have poisoned his food. Memory pulled him back to childhood, when he believed his constant sickness was simply due to a weak constitution, never suspecting the hand feeding him the poison himself. He only understood later that not even the servants had been on his side. Thinking back on those days filled him with disgust strong enough to make him want to wring the man's neck. The butler startled as Ferda gripped his shoulder near the gate, praising him instead, telling him he'd worked hard all these years. The old man faltered unsettled, saying that taking care of someone like him for so long couldn't have been easy. Ferda simply asked him to excuse himself. With that exchange behind him, Ferda asked the butler to look after the Roznova family in his absence. As the carriage pulled away from the estate, riding along, Ferda reflected that his calm came from having already gotten his revenge once before his mind was at peace. Passing through the quiet countryside, he admitted to himself that the anger and thirst for vengeance he once carried didn't stir in him anymore. He recalled the archmage magic he'd once wielded, comparing it to a drug that had taken hold of him completely. It had been exhilarating in the beginning, the power flowing through him as he tore through enemies without restraint. But as his tolerance grew, it became something he could no longer control, a true narcotic. When the madness fully took hold, everything had felt thrilling, even euphoric, burning through him like fire consuming his own heart. Sitting in the carriage now, Ferda told himself he didn't want to live like that anymore. He let out a slow breath, admitting that tasting peace for the first time in a while wasn't so bad, and wondered if this meant he wouldn't have to awaken as a mage again. The carriage rattled to a stop along a mountain path as the escort called out that they had arrived. A wooden sign stood at the edge of the trees, its warning carved plainly into the wood. Beyond that point lay the Duke's territory, and entry was strictly forbidden. Ferda sat alone on his suitcase in the quiet clearing, waiting, the forest settling into stillness around him. He thought back on the coachman who had fled the moment Ferda mentioned a dragon might appear, wishing him health as the carriage sped away without looking back. Left alone, Ferda admitted it was nice not being watched anymore, but if some wild beast actually leapt out of the trees, he'd have nothing to defend himself with. He decided he'd need to pick up some magic to survive out here, maybe just a light 4-circle spell. A rustle moved through the brush, and his eyes sharpened as he sensed someone approaching. A maid stepped out from among the leaves, introducing herself as Ruri, a servant of Lord Valdrova. She asked if he was Lord Ferda Roznova. He confirmed that he was. Ruri offered to escort him to the castle, gesturing toward the distant peak rising beyond the trees, and led the way forward. The story shifted back, recalling how the citizens of the Arkan Empire had once been drunk on the idea of their nation's unstoppable power, though. In truth, that strength was far from perfect. In the eastern reaches of the continent lay the Land of Demons, a region overrun with monsters that no army of the Empire had ever been able to conquer. But everything changed the day a single force halted the Horde's advance and claimed the front line as her own, the Red Dragon, Valdrova. Ferda walked through the woods, suitcase in hand, thinking it strange that someone who'd built the only line of defense in that demon-infested land was branded a demon dragon instead of a hero. He recalled the rumors that followed her, whispers claiming she was secretly raising an army of monsters behind the Empire's back. Yet none of those same people dared say a single word once they stood before her directly. Ruri glanced back and told him there was no need to worry. She raised a hand, a faint glow rising from her palm, assuring him that as long as he stayed close to her, nothing would dare attack him recklessly. Ferda offered a quiet word of thanks, As they pressed on, Ferda asked how much farther they had left to walk. Ruri answered that it would take about 2 hours on foot. He asked how she had gotten all the way out there in the first place. She replied that flying alone took her exactly 10 seconds. Ferda studied her a moment longer, catching himself thinking that she was clearly no ordinary maid. The truth of Ruri became clear. She carried the blood of a dragon in her veins, born with strength and magic that set her far above ordinary spawn, her horns and tail hidden away beneath her uniform. A staff struck the ground as Ferda considered their options, wondering aloud if they should fly to the lair the same way as before. Ruri asked flatly if that meant she'd have to carry him again. She added that it wasn't a matter of worry, she simply didn't want to. Ferda accepted her answer without argument, only suggesting they take a short rest since they'd been walking so long. Ruri cut him off, telling him to keep moving since her master was waiting. He let out a tired breath, thinking to himself that getting married was never easy. Watching the sunset stretch over the mountains ahead. At last they reached towering doors and Ruri announced that his fiancée had arrived. Ferda felt something powerful radiating from beyond the door, and wondered if a dragon's mere presence could really be this overwhelming. Ruri told him she would go deliver the message, and warned him not to act rashly, to simply wait. Ferda asked if they couldn't just speak to each other directly instead. A voice inside snapped at her, demanding to know if someone of her low station dared think she had the right to stand before him. Ruri answered simply that she understood and would go. A moment later, she returned glowing with anticipation, announcing that she would now deliver the message from Duke Valdrova. The dragon's voice rang out, addressing the one who'd come to betroth her by imperial decree, commending him for venturing this far despite knowing of her brutality, but stating she had no desire for a forced engagement. The dragon told him plainly to return to where he came from. Ferda's expression tightened as he realized what was happening. He'd come all this way to become her fiancée, and she intended to send him back. He thought that in his past life, he would have jumped at the chance to leave without a second thought. But he was different. Now he said aloud that although this engagement had started as an imperial decree, standing there that day was his own choice. Ruri lit up, delighted, declaring that he had no intention of turning back and wished to proceed with the engagement. Silence answered her. Ruri asked whether she wasn't going to deliver his response. The voice replied only that it understood. A fist tightened, and moments later, a heavy sack of gold dropped in front of Ferda, the dragon's voice praising the resolve that had brought him there of his own free will, offering him wealth in case returning home put him in a difficult position. The dragon added that the gold was so he could leave this place and build a new life elsewhere. Ferda looked back at her calmly and said he had no interest in power or wealth. Ferda knelt before the dragon and declared that the only thing he cared about was his engagement to Duke Valdrova. Ruri stood tense, her fist clenched, letting out a heavy breath as she absorbed what he'd just said. Her hand snapped up in a sudden strike, ready to act on his words. She pointed straight at him, warning that she wouldn't waste her breath twice, and ordered him to leave the premises at once. Ferda remarked dryly that it was quite a short message for someone speaking on behalf of Duke Valdrova. Ruri corrected him, telling him these were her own words as her master's servant, not a message, and if he refused to leave, her claws lengthened, horns breaking free from beneath her disguise as green energy exploded around her, revealing her true dragon spawn form. She lunged at him, accusing him of being scum who cared nothing for Lord Valdrova, consumed only by power and ambition, and calling out his dragon fear as proof. Ferda, catching his breath from the pressure crushing down on him, realized aloud that this was exactly what had killed the third prince before him. The prince, in his time, had carried nothing but schemes to exploit the marriage and use it to subjugate Valdrova, hiding his greed behind a signed marriage contract. The dragon's eyes had burned with fury back then, seeing him as nothing more than a shameless fool who thought he could hide his greed. Ruri's foot came down hard as she agreed coldly that the prince had indeed been arrogant. She slammed Ferda to the ground, telling him that in her eyes, he was no different from that same prince. She gripped his collar, demanding to know if he wished to meet the same fate as the third prince for daring to deceive her master. Struggling for air, Ferda swore then and there, as Ferda Raznova, that his words carried not a single speck of deceit. He insisted he hadn't come under anyone's coercion, nor was he seeking any profit or gain from this engagement. He thought back to how, in their final moments together, she had once given her own heart freely to a selfish man like him. He declared that this time he had come as the man who would become Valdrova's fiancé, vowing that he would stand by her side. A young man with dark hair stands before an unseen presence, declaring that he has arrived as the one intended to be Valdrova's fiancé. He adds that, since they are to be bound as husband and wife, all future words between them should pass directly, without a servant standing in the middle. A clawed, monstrous hand rises from the shadows, reacting to what it has just heard. A voice within the darkness mutters in anger, calling the man an insolent brat for his bold words. A pale-haired maid with curling horns lunges forward in fury, bearing sharp fangs and claws as she shouts that no one is permitted to speak such nonsense in front of her master. The maid moves fast, striking down the guards standing between her and the man who spoke. Once they are on the ground, she straightens herself, apologizes briefly for the interruption, and the man simply responds that he understands. The maid recalls the exact words she was sent to deliver, repeating internally that the visitor introduced himself as the one who would become Valdrova's fiancé. Kneeling in a dim stone chamber, the maid repeats the statement aloud to her master, confirming that this is exactly what the human said. She addresses the towering shadow dragon before her with reverence, calling them her master, one of the great 12 rulers, and the embodiment of absolute power. A voice belonging to a red-haired woman questions whether what she just heard is actually true. The red-haired woman, revealed as Red Dragon Archduke Valdrova, curls up with quiet interest, admitting she is curious what kind of person would dare say something like that. Valdrova asks the maid directly what impression she got of the human. The maid recalls the man stumbling through the forest, exhausted and struggling just to reach the castle. The maid bluntly calls the human incredibly ugly and suggests they should be disposed of immediately, prompting Valdrova to call out her name in warning. The maid backtracks, admitting his face was actually quite fair, the type that could make many women cry, but Valdrova clarifies that isn't what she was asking about. The maid pauses, reflecting further, and admits there was something unusual about him. She explains that as a dragon spawn, she has an aura built to intimidate mortals, since frightening a human is normally effortless for her kind. Yet she recalls that when she unleashed her full pressure onto him, the man showed no fear whatsoever, not even flinching. Because of that, the maid concludes he would likely be able to look directly at Valdrova without breaking down. Unlike most humans, the maid smiles faintly to herself, satisfied with her own reasoning, and Valdrova quietly responds that this is good to hear. Valdrova rises from the stone steps, murmuring that a human capable of meeting her gaze without fear is rare. She touches her chest gently, admitting that such a person might finally let her face others normally, without the usual dread in their eyes. Valdrova repeats the word, normal, softly, as if testing whether she can still believe in it. The maid stood in the ruined hall, silver-haired and composed, answering the question put to her without hesitation. A young man dropped his bag at the castle gate, startled by the words waiting for him. The engagement was moving forward whether he was ready or not. The maid led him through the long stone corridor, her voice flat as she pointed the way toward the guest room. The room she brought him to was a bedroom, kept in immaculate condition, far better than he expected for a place like this. He noted the cleanliness aloud and asked who was responsible for maintaining it. She answered simply that she was the one. She introduced herself further, stating plainly that she served as the only attendant to her master, then addressed him with a single word, guest. He caught the distinction immediately and questioned it. She reminded him that without a completed ceremony, he held no higher standing than guest one. Beside him, a small hiss escaped her as she muttered that she disliked humans, watching him with the wary posture of a guard dog sizing up an intruder. He suggested dropping the formalities between them and asked when the ceremony would take place. She told him it would happen in 1 month. The three of them stood before the ceremonial curtain, the dragon bride in white, the maid holding the ledger, and the man beside her, the vows to be exchanged quietly, hidden within the dragon's own lair. He accepted the timeline without argument, straightening his collar as he processed what 1 month would actually demand of him. The maid crossed her arms, unimpressed, and made it clear the ceremony would not simply be gifted to him. The month ahead was a test of whether he deserved it at all. She jabbed a finger at him, declaring that anyone standing beside a ruler as great as her mistress needed to carry the status to match, and the deadline stood firm at 1 month. He was told outright to prove himself worthy of the title of fiancé, the demand catching him off guard. He accepted the challenge with a tired exhale, muttering that marriage, it seemed, was never going to be the easy part. He asked if this test was his master's decision. She corrected him. It was entirely her own will, not an order from above. She explained further that her master was too soft-hearted to hold him to such standards, but she herself had no intention of letting it go unchecked. With a clenched fist, she demanded he prove that even his weak human body carried any real potential. Behind her, on a throne wrapped in draconic scale and claw, sat the one whose approval mattered most, and the warning was clear: fail this, and no title of fiancé would grant him recognition as partner of the Archduke. Closing his eyes in thought, He considered his situation and admitted, if only to himself, that his fiancée had a formidable person watching her back. Even with no fondness for him, the maid reasoned that her demands came from loyalty to her master, pointing out exactly what a partner needed to be, in a memory buried deep. The dragon held a glowing heart in its claws, mourning that someone once so loyal had vanished at the final moment of need. She offered him a way out, asking plainly how high he would need to climb. Did he need to become emperor of the empire himself? He clarified he only needed enough standing that no other ruler would look down on her. He scoffed at how easily she said it, pointing out she was asking him to prove potential strong enough to surpass an emperor. Despite the complaint, he accepted the terms with a faint smile already turning the problem over in his mind. She eyed him with suspicion, unsettled by how calm he seemed given what he'd just agreed to. She snapped at him, asking if he was taking dragons lightly, or if his mind simply wasn't working right. He answered that it was neither. He told her not to worry, promising he would show her abilities convincing enough within a single month. Left alone, she frowned, wondering what exactly this human was placing his confidence in to speak with such certainty. Alone in his room at night, he admitted to himself that in his current state, he held no real power to speak of. But mages were rare on this continent, and rarer still were those who had ever reached the 8th circle, an experience that belonged to him alone. If he could recover the senses he once carried, reaching that level, again, was entirely within reach for any mage. The 1st circle mattered most of all, the crossroads inside the chest that decided the direction the mana circuit would take. Own path formed the blue circle, built through calm and steady meditation, slow but stable, the road most mages walked. The other path formed the red circle, born from turbulent emotion instead of discipline. That path consumed the caster from within, twisting them toward madness, and it was the path he himself had once walked, becoming an archmage on hatred alone. He remembered it clearly, kneeling over a fallen body, telling himself he could grow strong faster by walking that same road again. But this time, he chose differently, deciding to build his strength on something steadier so nothing could shake him again. 1 week passed. He sat cross-legged on the floor of his room, deep in meditation, mana stirring quietly around him. A blue circle bloomed to life in his hands, calm and controlled, proof that this time, his path was his own to choose. Another attempt sputtered out, leaving him breathless. Failure again, the mana dispersing from his hands before it could take proper shape. Building a blue circle normally took 3 years at minimum. Having the senses of his former self, he'd hoped to shorten that drastically, but it carried a texture, nothing like the red circle he once knew. Only 3 weeks remained if progress stayed at this pace. The maid entered carrying a tray, setting a bowl down and asking flatly if he was prepared. He answered that he was working on it. She glanced at the untouched stew and remarked that nothing about it had changed. He insisted it would come together if he kept at it. She said nothing, only staring with visible doubt. Even he had to admit there had been no real progress. A different approach was clearly needed. As he lifted a spoonful toward his mouth, a low rumbling began to shake the room around them. Startled by the vibration, he asked what was causing it. She answered plainly that her master was in the middle of suppressing monsters. He repeated the words back, surprised. She explained that far to the east in the land of demons, her mistress was personally wiping out the monsters surfacing there. He turned toward the window, quiet for a moment, then said he wanted to witness that battle with his own eyes. She warned him he'd better not go. When he asked why, her expression turned sharp. A human mind, she told him, could not endure what he was asking to witness. She added that, unless he wanted to embarrass himself before the engagement ceremony, it would be wiser not to see it at all. He fell silent. He refused outright, insisting it was his duty as her future partner to see the fight with his own eyes. She lifted into the air, wings spread, carrying him swiftly through the sky toward the battlefield. They touched down at last on open grass, her voice announcing that they had arrived. The speed of her flight had been staggering, comparable to teleportation itself. Once his feet met solid ground, nausea hit him hard. She told him what he needed to focus on wasn't his own discomfort. Steadying himself, his eyes sharpened, urged to get up and look at what lay ahead. In the distance, a monstrous roar tore through the sky as the two of them stood together atop a cliff, facing the storm rolling in below. Below the ridge, a swirling storm of dark energy churned around a coiled monster, its many limbs writhing beneath the clouds. That was the place where Voldrova was fighting. The creature's segmented body burst apart under a blinding strike, only for flames to erupt and a dragon to tear through the wreckage. Overhead, two more of the beasts screeched at each other, centipede-like limbs snapping through the smoke as Valdrova's roar cut through the chaos below. The dragon's head twisted through the ruin, jaws parting as heat gathered behind her teeth. She launched herself skyward and unleashed her fire breath, a single column of flame splitting the battlefield in two. The blast tore forward with tremendous force, jaws wide as the shockwave rolled outward across the land. The dragon shrieked as the attack connected, and Ferda staggered under the force, reaching him even from a distance. He collapsed to his knees, gripping the ground, stunned that a single attack carried this much raw power. His hand shook against his chest as the aftershock of the dragon's roar rattled through his body, leaving him breathless and pale. Valdrova descended toward him, remarking coldly on how absurd it was for a human to think himself fit to stand beside a dragon. As the flames settled and her true form towered the field, she told him plainly that this was the real shape of the one who would become his partner. Valdrova stood on the open field as the wind caught her wings, watching Ferda's trembling hand close around her own. She had warned him beforehand, and his shaking only confirmed what she expected. Kneeling on the grass, Ferda absorbed the blood of the red dragon flowing into him, its glow surrounding his hunched frame while Valdrova stood beside him, watching the transfer take place. The blood carried more than power. It carried a savage bloodlust, a hunger for destruction bred into every drop of a dragon's essence. Ferda struggled against the rising urge inside him, fists clenched to the ground. Valdrova explained that this instinct was inborn, tied to their very nature, and warned him that resolve alone would not be enough to survive it. In the darkness, Valdrova watched Ferda collapse under the weight of the bloodlust, believing this pain would finally teach him what she already knew. Humans and dragons could never truly become one, and her hope of living beside him was nothing more than a broken dream. Yet when Ferda lifted his head again, he wasn't broken. A small, unexpected smile crossed his face as he called the sensation magnificent, gripping the red gem hanging from his neck. Valdrova stared at him, stunned. He wasn't afraid. He was impressed, and that reaction unsettled her more than fear ever could. She snapped, calling him an insane masochist, her composure cracking as blood rushed to her face at his bizarre response to agony. Later that night, back within the castle walls, Ferda admitted to himself that even though he expected this pain, the reality of it was something else entirely. Sprawled across his bed, arms outstretched, he confessed that his whole body felt wrecked, the dragon's fear and its roar still echoing through him. Valdrova, exhausted from carrying him back, muttered that it was a miracle his mind stayed intact at all. Ferda barely lifting his head, worried that at this rate, he wouldn't just fail to open his circle, he would lose the entire day alone under the moonlight. He asked himself why he had even wanted to witness that battle in the first place. Arms spread as the wind moved through the grass around him, he replayed what he had seen that day. Sitting quietly on the hillside as the wind carried loose petals past him, the memory refusing to fade. The roar had been terrifying beyond words, fire and destruction erupting around her form, and still, despite the terror, he wanted to keep watching her. Hidden away at the eastern edge of the world, she tore through monsters without hesitation, crushing everything in her path. But her violence was never senseless. Every strike existed for one reason alone: to protect what she loved. She fought like a noble Crimson Knight, one who had willingly chosen a path of hardship over comfort or safety. Watching her, Ferda called it magnificent. Walking through the golden field and admitting quietly that for someone like her, and someone like him, things could still be different. Back in his room, a strange sensation surged through him. He recognized it. A red circle had formed, undeniable and impossible to ignore. He realized this wasn't the mana he needed and feared repeating what had gone wrong in the past. Gritting his teeth, he forced himself to reject it, refusing to let history repeat itself. A drop of blood fell into water, rippling outward. From the crimson pool, an armored figure rose, sword raised high. Ferda stared at the reflection, whispering her name in disbelief. Valdrova. The more he replayed her battle in his mind, the clearer his mana circuit became. His hand reached toward the vision, and he recognized the feeling stirring inside him as something born of neither rage nor vengeance. He questioned what this new feeling could be called, sitting cross-legged atop the rippling crimson pool. It was faint, indistinct, and he sensed it could vanish completely if he didn't grasp it now. Two hands reached toward a swirling core of light and energy. He told himself to focus entirely on this emotion, holding it steady before it slipped away. Lightning crackled around him as he sat still, eyes closed, channeling the energy building inside his chest. The swirling mass compressed, spinning faster and faster under his will, tightening into a dense controlled sphere of power. With a final burst, he shaped it into a single circle, a complete magic circuit forming in his palm. He told himself this time would be different. He clenched his fist against his chest, vowing that the same future and the same mistakes he had lived through before would never happen again. The next morning, Valdrova stared at him in shock, asking if he had truly opened his mana circuit in a single night. She admitted she had noticed his growth immediately, praising his keen improvement, but questioned how someone who could barely stand the day before could accomplish something no ordinary person should be able to do overnight. Ferda replied simply that he managed it because he was no ordinary person, then asked for her opinion on his progress. Valdrova confirmed he met the minimum requirements, though he admitted quietly to himself that he still had a long way to go. Wiping his hands clean, he asked if there was anywhere nearby where he could practice his magic properly. Elsewhere, practice targets stood lined up across an open field, a broom sweeping dust aside nearby. Valdrova revealed the training ground she had built exactly as he requested, announcing it proudly with a sweep of her hand. Ferda clapped, impressed that she had constructed a fully equipped training yard by herself in just half a day, calling her Valdrova's one and only attendant. Indeed, she questioned why he had only asked for simple practice targets instead of costly magical tools. Curious what exactly he intended to train, he explained that his goal was efficient mana control, since without it, mana would be wasted needlessly. Valdrova asked innocently why that would even happen, wondering if dragons simply didn't have that problem. Ferda noted that any other dragon spawn would call his method primitive, then asked if she thought the same. Valdrova, exhausted, revealed that she too was a dragon spawn herself. He fell silent for a moment before laughing quietly to himself, wondering how someone born naturally gifted could ever understand human effort. Ferda walked past Valdrova at the training ground, asking if he could watch her train, only to be met with silence and a flat suggestion that he'd rather watch someone practice breathing. He turned away without another word, closing his eyes as he steadied his breath and focused inward. He recalled the principle behind mana control, that stability formed the foundation of it, and that stability was the nature of the blue circle. But his circle was red, forcing him to stir his emotions into a frenzy while simultaneously holding them under control, knowing only by conquering that contradiction could real power take shape. It took an entire year just to draw mana upward through the raging current inside him, his hand trembling and bleeding from the strain. It took another year to compress that mana into a sphere, recreating the projectile he had once forged through blood and sweat in his previous life. What had taken years before now took only 2 minutes. A small red orb of condensed mana sparked to life at his fingertip, steady and controlled. Valdrova stared, stunned, recognizing that the sphere held no wasted mana at all. She realized he had mastered mana control on his very first attempt. He launched the spheres toward the practice targets in the distance, calling out the command to fire. The mana shot tore through the air, roaring toward its target with tremendous force. The blast struck true, detonating against the target in a burst of fire and light, while Valdrova watched from behind him. Ferda dusted off his shoulder, satisfied, remarking that, as expected, it had survived the impact. Elsewhere, Ruri finished delivering her report on Lord Ferda, and the red-haired figure listening praised her for a job well done, surprised he had awakened as a mage so soon after arriving. She admitted she still knew too little to judge exactly how remarkable that truly was, then asked Ruri, who understood the outside world better, what she made of him. Ruri answered that he had been flawless from the very beginning, without a single misstep, which was precisely why he seemed suspicious and dangerous. The red-haired woman asked why that would be a problem. Ruri explained that no human could possibly reach that level without making a single mistake, concluding that he had to be hiding something before losing her composure and blurting that he might be some kind of pain-loving pervert. The woman noted that for Ruri to praise a human so highly, he must grow more remarkable the longer she observed him. Ruri admitted, reluctantly, that it was true. The woman reassured her not to worry, reasoning that since he had approached her with sincere intentions, she would place her trust in him. Ruri looked away, thinking quietly that her master had already suffered enough at human hands before. She resolved that, now that her master's heart had finally opened again, she could not allow it to be broken a second time, wondering if there was some way to test his true intentions. Ruri raised the idea to her master while they still had the chance, suggesting they entrust that to Ferda. The red-haired woman's eyes narrowed with interest as she asked exactly what Ruri meant by that. Elsewhere, Ferda made his grand entrance into a formal hall, dressed in a striking red and gold coat as his name was announced aloud, marking his arrival before the gathered crowd. The lords of the Far East Front Alliance gather around a round table, summoned by the Archduke. Murmurs spread as they wonder why they've been called together at such an unusual time. Two nobles trade complaints, questioning why they're meeting so casually when monster invasions loom. One reveals the real reason. The Archduke's newly decided fiancé is arriving. The others react with shock at the news. The lords mock the situation, calling it foolish that anyone would treat this engagement as a real marriage. One noble reveals the groom's identity, the third son of the Roznova family, a young man who has just come of age. More lords scoff, dismissing an 18-year-old as unfit to stand among them despite the Archduke's backing. Rumors circulate that he is defective, unable to even wield a sword, prompting sharper protests from those defending the Roznova name. An older lord, unmoved, dismisses the growing gossip. He sees no reason to take the boy seriously, certain the engagement won't last. The same lord, Count Olvera Concilis, adds that this fiancé will eventually be discarded by the Archduke. Anyway, the others nod in quiet agreement, resigned to the assumption that the match is temporary. The grand doors swing open, flooding the hall with light. A young man steps through, a maid trailing behind him. His arrival is announced formally. Lord Ferda Roznova has entered. Ferda walks forward, his expression calm and unreadable. The maid following silently at his side. He says nothing, letting his presence speak first. Earlier, in a quiet room, Ferda flips through an old book filled with unfamiliar script. He mutters to himself, reluctant, wondering if he truly has to attend the meeting right now. The maid, patient but firm, tells him this is something he cannot avoid forever. She asks if he understands why her master is called Archduke Voldrova. Ferda answers simply that he does. The book's pages reveal the truth. Valdrova's title comes from a mark of darkness, tied to the origins of the Demon King. The one who slew the Black Dragon Godwyn was Valdrova herself. For that feat, she was granted the rank of Archduke and given her territory by the Empire. The maid explains that Valdrova's priority now is subjugating monsters, meaning Ferda, as her future consort, must take charge of managing the territories and lords of the Eastern Front in her place. She lays out the arrangement plainly. The master handles matters outside, while Ferda manages everything within. Ferda asks half to himself if that makes him the lady of the house. He considers the shift in power now resting in his hands, unsettled by how quickly authority has been handed to him. Still, he accepts, telling the maid he will go and meet the lords. Standing at the center of the round table, Ferda faces the assembled nobles. He introduces himself as the one who will soon become the consort of Archduke Voldrova, then pauses before continuing further. He asks the lords directly how he should treat them, his tone level and searching. The lords exchange uneasy glances, sensing the weight behind his question. One mutters that he already seems formidable from the first greeting, aware that whoever speaks next will set the tone for everything to come. An older lord, grinning, answers on behalf of the group. They are simply lords residing under the Archduke's light, nothing more. Another adds that respecting the future consort is only natural before trailing off with a pointed however, leaving the rest of his true feelings unspoken. The old lord's grin fades as he presses his point. Since the lords swore loyalty to the Empire long before Ferda was born, it is only right for the consort to show them corresponding courtesy in return. The others nod along, murmuring their agreement, satisfied that they've steered the conversation toward demanding deference from the newcomer. Ferda asks plainly if that is their final answer, whether he should treat them with respect or treat them as subordinates. He tells them flatly to just answer the question. The old lord hesitates, then concedes that it would indeed be right for the consort to treat them as subordinates. He calls it useful to have that settled as a reference point. Ferda continues, noting that becoming consort won't change much for them directly. Their territories remain their own to manage as they always have, whether that means good governance or extortion. One lord explodes at the accusation, demanding to know if Ferda is implying they fleece their own citizens. Ferda raises a hand and backs off smoothly, claiming it was only a slip of the tongue, with no ill will intended. Watching the exchange, a maid narrows her eyes, thinking she now understands exactly why he was cast out by his own family. One of the lords sneers that Ferda must be scraping for scraps of magic knowledge because he was abandoned by a knight family, then snaps that a mere one circle fiancé ought to mind his manners before his superiors. He adds that Ferda only stands there because of his engagement to the Archduke, and demands to know what makes him better than a four-circle mage. Ferda repeats the words back quietly. Four-circle, huh? The maid tenses, startled by what she just heard him say. The lord boasts that a four-circle mage is treated with reverence everywhere, since a mage's rank is strictly determined by skill. Outraged that a mere one circle would dare insult him, Sparks crackle around his raised hand as he snarls that he'll fix Ferda's rotten attitude personally. Ferda cuts in calmly, saying that if that is how it is, he has a proposal the Lord might like. He suggests testing the skills of a mere one. Circle directly challenging the Lord to a duel. Word spreads fast, and soon banners line the courtyard as onlookers gather to watch a duel between a 1-circle mage and a 4-circle mage. Two lords whisper that the outcome seems obvious, though one wonders aloud whether the mage, Thessalos, might actually go easy on Ferda, given how convenient it would be to have him taught a lesson. The maid watches silently from the sidelines as wind gathers around the two figures standing opposite each other in the dueling circle. Ferda asks his opponent calmly what kind of magic he intends to use. Thessalos bristles at the question, indignant that Ferda would ask him to reveal his hand before a duel, calling it rude. Thessalos taunts him further, mocking that Ferda must already be growing afraid, before declaring that forfeit is still an option once he hears what is coming. He unleashes the 4th-tier spell Magic Blast, unleashing his full confidence into the attack. The crowd gasps as the destructive spell surges forward, questioning whether Ferda could possibly survive a direct hit from something so specialized. Ferda answers calmly that he'll share something in return. He states plainly that the only magic he knows is Mana Shot. Thessalos repeats the name back mockingly, sneering at such a basic spell. He questions how anyone could hope to beat him with something so weak. Ferda replies without hesitation that he doesn't think he'll lose. Asked why he is so certain, Ferda simply states that he happens to know quite a lot. Thessalos snarls at the perceived arrogance, gathering his magic with fury. He roars that he'll erase Ferda without a trace, funneling murderous intent into the spell as onlookers realize he is a red circle mage, deliberately raising the output to overwhelming levels. Ferda murmurs quietly that it is a shame, unmoved by the display. Small red orbs of light streak forward, gathering speed and power as they close in. Thessalos suddenly recoils in shock, sensing something has gone wrong mid-cast. Ferda states coldly that the outcome has already been decided, his own spell forming steadily between his hands. A wall of crimson energy rises in response, and onlookers recognize it instantly as defensive magic meeting the incoming blast. Thessalos stares in confusion, realizing Ferda's attack was never aimed at him at all, but at the nearly finished magic circle behind him. The circle shatters violently, the shockwave tearing through the arena as Thessalos recoils from the unexpected destruction of his own spell foundation. Onlookers watch in disbelief, stunned that a supposed 1-circle mages could produce a technique capable of shattering someone else's magic circle outright. Thessalos collapses to his knees, breathless and trembling, forced to admit to himself that he has lost. Ferda asks Thessalos plainly if he concedes standing over him as the mage kneels on the ground, spent from the duel. Thessalos stares upward in silence, memory surfacing of an old ambition buried deep, a wish to grow stronger that had once driven him forward. He admits defeat aloud, recalling how he had once vowed that nothing would be off limits if it meant gaining strength. The lords watching from the round table erupt in disbelief, unable to accept that a 4-circle mage lost to a 1-circle. One accuses a dragon spawn of secretly intervening, prompting a sharp threat from the maid nearby to remove his useless eyes if he still doubts what he witnessed. Back at the arena, Thessalos kneels and takes Ferda's hand, praising his magic as extraordinary and admitting he would have been in real danger had Ferda been only slightly faster. He adds that witnessing the East's strength puts his mind at ease. Ferda reflects that being demoted from the capital may not have been such a bad turn of fate after all, especially now that his worth has been recognized. He tells Thessalos it is an honor to meet him. Ferda asks for his name, noting he heard he'd been demoted from the capital. Thessalos introduces himself as Thessalos Vulture. Recognition dawns on Ferda's face as he repeats the name aloud, then asks directly if Thessalos remembers him. Ferda states that he knows Thessalos very well because Thessalos was once his benefactor. Confused, Thessalos asks when such a thing could have happened between them, unable to recall any connection. Ferda raises his hand and unleashes Mana Shot without warning, the attack tearing forward with devastating force. The strike connects, sending Thessalos crumpling backward in silhouette against the light. The lords watching the scene cry out in shock at the sudden violence. Ferda states coldly that he cannot allow Thessalos to live, since keeping him alive would only bring sorrow to his fiancée. Blood pooled across the marble floor as Ferda stood over the body he had just cut down. Nobles behind him froze in place, staring at the scene with wide, disbelieving eyes. Someone finally choked out his name. The camera lingered on the dead man's crumpled coat, the noble finery now soaked and ruined. A stark line of text made the moment clear he had just killed a member of the nobility. The duel had technically ended, but Ferda had struck the killing blow before anyone could intervene. The lords whispered among themselves in horror, calling it nothing short of the murder of a noble. A pause hung over the hall as the shock set in. No one understood why a man like Ferda would dare face down someone with this much backing. His expression stayed cold, a fresh cut bleeding down his cheek. Ferda brushed off the stunned silence around him, asking the group why they looked so shaken, wondering aloud if it had something to do with the dead man, Thessalos. He told them plainly not to worry about it. In his view, Thessalos deserved to die, and letting him live would have only brought grief to the Grand Duchess. The nobles reeled, stunned that the Grand Duchess's name had anything to do with this. One of the lords pressed him, asking if this was truly his first encounter with Thessalos or the rest of them, demanding to know what possible connection Thessalos' death could have to the Grand Duchess being upset. Ferda's answer was simple. Grand Duchess Valdrova wanted humans to live happily. Blood traced down his face as he said it, his gaze unreadable. He continued walking through the hall, explaining that she was a merciful ruler who fought for humanity despite living inside the body of a dragon, and that Thessalos had acted against everything she stood for. He added that this was a matter tied to something further ahead. He admitted that what he meant hadn't happened yet, that it belonged to a future too distant to prove here. The lord stared at him in disbelief, muttering that he was claiming to have killed a man over a crime that hadn't even occurred, calling him a lunatic. Ferda told them not to worry about it, and that he had no interest in whatever the rest of them thought or did about the situation. His tone stayed flat, his wound still fresh. The scene shifted to a carriage rattling down a muddy road under heavy rain, wheels grinding against the wet path. Inside, Ferda sat holding his head clearly worn down, while a young woman with pale hair sat across from him, his head spun from exhaustion. His thoughts drifted back to the duel, recalling that he hadn't expected to cross paths with Thessalos, the man he privately called a vulture. Using his mana shot had drained him completely. The rocking motion of the carriage only made things worse, leaving him queasy. He found himself wishing for mana-powered cars, technology that hadn't even been invented in this era. The maid across from him reacted with theatrical amazement, praising him for killing one of the Grand Duchess's most loyal subjects during their very first meeting, remarking that it would surely complicate the engagement. Ferda asked if she meant Thessalos, and she confirmed it, revealing that the man had in fact been one of the lords loyal to the Grand Duchess. He sighed, calling the situation troublesome, then asked whether Thessalos had at least been an honest man. The maid described him as moderately upright and moderately corrupt, which by regional standards counted as respectable, especially compared to the other lords, who spent their time enriching themselves even while their men died on the front lines. She summed it up bluntly: the lords were a mess. Despite it all, Ferda concluded that the engagement should still move forward as planned, since his reason for killing Thessalos was, in his eyes, entirely justified. Ferda thought back, sifting through his memory for the crime he needed to prove, while a wrapped bundle sat nearby, hinting at what he'd brought along. He recalled that Thessalos should still be committing his crime even now, given the timing. Behind that thought, House Vulture's castle stood lit up under a burning sunset sky. An elderly butler greeted them at the entrance, bowing deeply and welcoming the guests from the Grand Duchess's castle to the lordly halls of House Vulture. He apologized that the master of the house was currently away, only for Ferda to casually correct him, stating that the man was dead, so there was no need to worry about his absence. The butler froze, stunned by the words. Ferda held out the wrapped bundle and told the butler to take it first. The old man's hands trembled as he accepted it, uncertain what it could be. Ferda instructed him to hang it somewhere visible near the castle gate. The maid beside them tilted her head, wondering aloud what exactly was inside. The moment the butler opened it, his face went pale with shock, the horror of what he saw striking him speechless. Inside Thessalos' bedroom, the group stepped past lavish furnishings, though the maid remarked that the emptiness made it feel like they had broken into an abandoned house. She warned Ferda that after publicly displaying the head of a supposed loyal subject, he'd better be able to prove that the man had truly been corrupt, or the backlash would fall on him. Then she pointed out that he had helped in that very act himself, having cut the head off Thessalos' corpse. She added dryly that she'd been considering calling off the engagement altogether, and asked if she should go retrieve that head for him. Before he could respond, she found something else, a hidden door built into the floor beneath the bed. Ferda knelt down, running his hand along the frame, certain there had to be some mechanism to open it. The maid told him to step aside, her fist already clenched and ready. With a single strike, she shattered the hidden door completely, splinters and dust bursting outward from the impact. She called back that it was open and that they should head inside, while Ferda stared at her, momentarily lost for words. Descending the stairs into the dark space below, the stench of old blood hung thick in the air, making it clear something terrible had happened down there. What awaited them was a hidden laboratory filled with the tangled remains of both humans and monsters, the wreckage making it obvious exactly who was responsible for such horrors. The scene was marked clearly as the work of demon followers, those who chase forbidden power and abandon their humanity in the process. Ferda identified one of the corpses as a soldier from the territory, noting that Thessalos had fused a dead soldier's organs with a monster's remains in some twisted experiment. A voice cut through the dark, calling out that only a lunatic with a death wish would dare intrude on something like this. The maid sighed, remarking that humans truly couldn't be trusted after all, adding that if Thessalos had really been a demon follower, that crime alone was more than enough to justify what had been done to him. The maid asked how he'd even known this hidden place existed in the first place, watching as Ferda studied a paper in his hands with a stern expression. His eyes narrowed on the page as he confirmed it. This was what he'd been searching for. The document was revealed as Thessalos' secret creation, a work called the Infinite Mana Cultivation Method, its pages filled with dense cryptic writing. A memory surfaced of Thessalos himself, hunched over the same notes in a hooded cloak, explaining excitedly that monsters constantly generate mana on their own. He continued, admitting that the mana monsters produced was naturally murky and low in quality, unusable in its raw form, but he proposed a way around that limitation, recreating a monster's mana production process artificially. The idea driving him further was whether that process could be used to continuously extract pure usable mana from it. If he could complete such a method, he reasoned, it would grant him an endless well of magic, enough to break past the natural ceiling imposed by circles. A voice praised the achievement, then asked what he intended to do with power like that. Thessalos answered with a manic grin, boasting that with the undead monster army this method could create, he would crush every noble who had once demoted him and cast him off to the evil dragon's territory. He laughed to himself, imagining that with this breakthrough, he might even climb high enough to be called a great mage. The listener simply responded with quiet acknowledgement. Back in the present, Ferda held the same research in his hands again, realizing this was the very method that had once let his past self reach the 8th circle faster than anyone else. Studying it now, he calculated that it could cut years off his path to the 8th circle. But a shadow of hesitation followed the thought. The maid remarked that seeing him covet something like this at least proved he was still human. Ferda noted grimly that the research was finished and its creator was already dead, meaning no one would ever know if he simply took it for himself. He added that this was exactly the kind of opportunity every human being secretly craved, offering her a hollow congratulations for the temptation in front of him. Before he could finish the thought, the maid tore the pages apart in one motion, cutting him off entirely. She instructed him plainly to destroy everything left in the laboratory, leaving no trace of the work behind. Stunned, she asked if he was serious, pointing out that he was still a mage by title and questioning whether he truly felt no pull toward the knowledge sitting right in front of him. Ferda admitted the research had real potential to reshape the entire field of magic, but immediately questioned what value that would hold for him. He reasoned that if he ever let himself be seduced by the promise of overwhelming power, and, in doing so, caused the Grand Duchess sorrow, it would be better to rip that temptation out by the root right now. His eyes hardened as he turned to the maid, throwing the choice back at her directly, asking if she would be the one to burn it. The maid closed the book in her hands and quietly agreed that burning it wasn't a difficult request at all. A blue flame erupted from the pages, the moment she called it forth, consuming the research in an instant. As the flame spread outward, a truth surfaced in Ferda's mind. Every spell a mage casts carries traces of the emotions behind it. That meant a caster's very essence became stained by the magic they used. Because Thessalos had carried deep hatred for the Empire, his spells were built from that same hatred, and in the end, that same dark magic had worn him down from within. Ferda recognized something else. Thessalos had once wielded a red circle, just like his own past self, driven by the same corrosive hatred and inferiority that had once consumed him. They were two men shaped by identical rage. He understood that if he inherited Thessalos' magic now, he would risk being eaten away by those same unbearable emotions all over again, so he resolved to abandon it completely. He thought back to his past self, a version of him that had forced himself into hatred simply to endure and survive, and let out a quiet exhale as the flames burned steady in front of him. Watching the fire consume the last of it, he remarked calmly that it burned surprisingly well. The maid stayed silent, privately labeling him an unpredictable, masochistic sort of madman, admitting to herself that he wasn't someone she'd want anywhere near her master, despite everything. She sighed and suggested they finally leave the musty ruins of the laboratory behind. Ferda agreed, adding that it would be improper to walk into the engagement ceremony with his master, still smelling of blood. The moment the words left his mouth, realization struck the maid. The engagement ceremony was finally about to begin. The morning of the engagement ceremony arrived at Grand Duchess Voldrova's castle, its towers rising against green mountains under a calm sky. A distant roar rumbled across the valley, cutting through the quiet like a warning nobody dared question. Inside the castle grounds, Lord Ferda walked beside a small maid, a folded paper in his hand. She asked if he'd finished writing his vows for the ceremony. Standing beneath the cathedral's tall windows, Ferda studied the paper in his grip. He remarked that holding a ceremony built on vows they'd written themselves made the Grand Duchess seem surprisingly romantic for someone of her reputation. The maid burst out laughing before he could finish the thought. Romantic, she said, was a generous word for it, considering the aspect of power was holding her engagement in a place worse than a stable. Even if the engagement itself didn't please her, the maid still wanted Valdrova to find some happiness in it, carrying that contradiction, wanting good for a mistress bound into an arrangement she never asked for, weighed on her more than she let show. She snapped at Ferda when he gave her an odd look, warning him not to wrinkle the ceremonial outfit she'd spent hours starching. When he stayed silent, she added that if venting at him made things easier, she supposed it was fine. Their talk shifted to matters beyond the castle. Ferda wondered aloud how the Grand Duchess's territory had held up since her last summons. Joking that the lord sent to the front lines hadn't exactly looked built for war. She explained further. When the lords first received autonomy, things had seemed manageable. But without oversight, they'd grown consumed by greed, lining their own pockets, while the people beneath them suffered. Riots simmered under military suppression, one spark away from breaking loose. Ferda called the situation serious, then asked why the Grand Duchess didn't simply intervene herself. A single word from her, he reasoned, and every corrupt lord would drop to their knees in an instant. The maid's answer stayed short, an unfinished promise that he'd understand soon enough. She turned away before he could press further, leaving the question hanging unanswered in the stone corridor. Ferda kept turning that answer over in his mind, wondering why she chose restraint when her strength could end the region's suffering with a single command. Ahead of him, rows of candlelight stretched into the dark, marking the path toward the ceremony. He reached massive doors deep within the mountain, where the maid stood waiting beside a small table holding a bowl and a bottle. She instructed him to take his seat and wait, her voice steady, despite the enormity of what lay beyond those doors. The doors groaned open on their own, revealing a passage lit in red firelight. A voice announced that the engagement ceremony would now begin, and Ferda knelt before the threshold, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. Pressure crashed into him the instant the doors parted further. He gritted his teeth, forcing a strained smile, despite the crushing force bearing down, refusing to let his composure crack in front of what waited inside. A massive golden eye watched him from the darkness, a clawed shape shifting just beyond the doorway. Kneeling before the table, Ferda questioned silently whether someone like him was truly permitted to stand in Valdrova's presence at all. A voice declared that today, mortal and immortal would become one. The maid stood beside the table as Ferda knelt opposite her, candlelight rippling across the cavern while a massive tail curled just out of sight. The vow continued, promising a bond neither heavenly authority nor time itself could break. The maid lifted a crystalline vessel filled with shimmering liquid, preparing to pour it as part of the rite that would seal the engagement. She poured the liquid into the bowl before him, the ceremony demanding that the mortal cast off uncertainty and fear, to become one with what waited beyond. The liquid swirled, catching the firelight as it settled. Ferda lifted the bowl and drank. He recognized immediately that this was no ordinary wine. Feeling its warmth spread through him, as the dragon's crushing presence began to ease, fading by degrees with every passing second. The ceremony's final line declared that the immortal would erase the futility of endless flow, sealing the bond completely. Behind him, a massive tail shifted in the shadows, the true weight of what he'd just bound himself to still waiting to be revealed. The bowl slipped from the table and shattered against stone, the ritual wine spilling everywhere. A cold voice cut through the cavern, announcing flatly that they would proceed again from the beginning. A short while later, Ferda knelt with a fresh bowl in his hands, sweat beading on his brow as he tried again to recite the vow. He barely got past the opening line before his voice wavered, and the words dissolved into confusion. He wondered silently how many times this had been now. His vision swimming from the wine already in his system. This was the first time he'd ever tasted alcohol in his life, and he'd clearly had far too much of it already. Beside him, the maid Luri watched the scene with visible unease, muttering under her breath that things might be getting dangerous. The massive armored figure across the table remained silent, watching Ferda's swaying form with unreadable patience. A grinding sound echoed through the chamber as the armored figure shifted. Excusing herself for a moment, she withdrew toward the shadows, leaving Ferda bowing repeatedly toward the empty air, still muttering apologies to no one. The moment she was out of sight, a furious voice erupted from beyond the doors, demanding to know exactly what Luri thought she was doing right now, addressing her as master with unmistakable frustration. The voice on the other side reminded her that she'd been the one who insisted on marrying a mortal in the first place, then asked pointedly what her loyal servant Luri had actually done to help. Luri fired back that she had endured it. The argument escalated, one voice accusing Luri of just hiding there, while her mistress's fiancé sat waiting alone. Luri shot back, demanding to know what that made the fiancé's feelings worth. Sitting there confused and ignored, the voice ordered Luri to come out proudly and greet her own fiancé properly, threatening that if the engagement wine got knocked over one more time, there would be no forgiveness for it. Ferda knelt frozen on the ground, having clearly overheard fragments of the argument echoing from behind the doors. Luri returned to his side and asked carefully whether he'd perhaps heard that, and he confirmed it had sounded like a roar rivaling dragon's breath. Recovering quickly, Luri explained that the outburst had simply been necessary to keep the ceremony running smoothly, adding somewhat awkwardly that her master suffered from social anxiety. Luri elaborated further, saying Lady Valdrova was reluctant to deal with humans at all, which was why she rarely left her lair except to hunt monsters. Beyond her, heavy chains crossed a massive sealed door, and Ferda's shock deepened at the thought of who exactly he was engaged to. Confused, Ferda asked how they were even supposed to continue the ceremony under these circumstances. Before Luri could answer, a hand curled slowly around the doorframe, gripping the stone as something massive prepared to step through. Golden armor emerged from the darkness, horned and gleaming, towering far taller than any human knight. Ferda stared upward, breath caught in his throat, unable to process what he was looking at beyond a single stunned word. Armor. He studied the figure carefully, wondering if she was hiding her face behind that enormous helm. He'd heard that a dragon's true polymorphed form was said to be wondrously beautiful, and none of that matched what stood before him now. Instead, the armored figure looked ready to march onto a battlefield, rather than attend an engagement ceremony. Despite the mismatch, the ceremony resumed anyway, the vow beginning once more from where it had left off. The recitation continued steadily this time, declaring that the mortal would cast off the unknown and wash away fear, while the immortal would erase the futility of endless flow, both becoming one through the ritual's binding words. Wine poured smoothly into the bowl without incident this time, the armored figure watching closely as Ferda accepted it with a small nod, his nerves visibly steadier than during his earlier failed attempts. As he looked up at her, something shifted behind that terrifying helm, and for a moment his own heartbeat quickened unexpectedly, a strange awareness settling over him that hadn't been there before. The armored figure's hands trembled faintly around the bowl's edge, an unspoken tension passing between them as two hearts pounded in an unfamiliar rhythm, neither willing to be the first to acknowledge what had just passed between them. Her gaze lingered on him from behind that massive helm, something unreadable passing over her expression. Ferda's own eye caught the light as their locked stares stretched a moment longer than either had planned. He wondered silently whether the engagement wine had loosened him too much, since the primal fear he'd felt earlier had simply vanished. It struck him then how much preparation she'd put into this, more than anyone would expect for what she considered an ordinary human. A sharp voice called for the vows to be read aloud now, each to the other. Ferda straightened, clutching the paper against his chest, sweat breaking out despite his effort to stay composed. He glanced down at the words he'd written, quietly reflecting that now that he'd returned to the past, these vows carried no real meaning anymore. Still, he found himself unable to dismiss them entirely. He began reading regardless. He told her that though she might not know much about him, he knew her, because she had given him her heart once, and through it, he'd come to understand who she truly was. Through that gift, he'd witnessed her betrayed and slandered more times than he could count. Yet she continued carrying out her duties with a dignity that never wavered despite it all. He continued, praising how she embraced even those who hated her without reason, her nobility never faltering when it came to protecting what she wished to love. That conviction, he admitted, had corrected his own path. Kneeling there, he declared that in this very place, he swore his devotion completely, his voice steady, despite the massive armored figure watching him in silence. Just as she had given her heart to him once before, he now intended to return that gift in full, offering himself the same way she had offered herself to him. This time, he promised, he would be the one to offer his heart to her, calling her his sovereign and his everything. The words carrying more weight than the polite phrasing of an ordinary vow. He added quietly that what came next hadn't been written in the vow at all. Glancing up toward the armored figure as something more personal rose to the surface, he told her plainly that he felt deeply honored to be engaged to a beauty such as her, his voice carrying genuine sincerity, despite the absurdity of complimenting someone hidden entirely behind armor. Luri fidgeted nervously off to the side as the voice announced that the bride-to-be would now read her own vow. A long silence followed before the armored figure finally responded with a hesitant, questioning address toward her own reflection. Master, something shifted suddenly within the armor, drawing a startled reaction from both Ferda and Luri, as static energy crackled visibly around the massive figure standing before them. The armored figure turned and walked away without a word, footsteps echoing heavily through the chamber. Behind her, Ferda and Luri exchanged a look of confused silence, unsure what had just happened. A voice soon announced that the engagement ceremony had been completed, telling Ferda he was free to return now. Luri stood beside him, equally stunned by the abrupt ending. She then asked somewhat sheepishly whether it would be acceptable for her to go into seclusion for about 3 days. Offering no further explanation beyond a simple apology, Luri clasped her hands together in prayer, praising her master's composure under pressure. Clearly proud of how the ceremony had unfolded, despite its strange conclusion, she gushed over how her master had struck down that arrogant man with a single blow, calling it a noble display worthy of a dragon, insisting she'd known all along it had been part of some larger plan. Alone now, the armored figure admitted silently that the initiative had shifted entirely into Ferda's hands, her composure cracking as she realized his declaration hadn't gone at all the way she had intended. Torn pages drifted down around Luri as she stood dwarfed beneath the massive dragon's true form, its horned head looming impossibly large above her. A voice rumbled through the chamber, asking pointedly whether she had really been looking forward to the engagement ceremony after all. Scattered fragments of the vow still falling like snow around them both. A pile of scattered papers covered the floor, discarded drafts of vows written and crumpled away. Among them lingered a quiet regret. She had wanted to recite the oath herself, as the one claiming him as her companion, but something had stopped her before the words could leave her mouth. Her expression hardened as she pressed the question that had been sitting heavy in her chest. She looked straight ahead and asked why he hadn't done it either. If the same thought had crossed his mind, a massive set of jaws opened before her, teeth catching the dim light. The answer came low and reluctant, admitting that confidence had failed him at the crucial moment. The dragon's voice rose over the sound of shifting stone and crumbling debris, insisting he could not bring himself to meet her eyes and speak the words aloud. The maid stood small before the towering creature, watching the confession unfold. A memory surfaced of a young man kneeling before an armored figure bathed in firelight, holding a folded letter. Sharp eyes had pierced through him in that moment, paired with a voice far gentler than he expected. He kept staring, caught by the sight in front of him, and somewhere in that instant everything shifted without warning. His thoughts scattered completely, the world around him fading into a haze of color and light. Nearby, a maid dressed in white watched the exchange, quietly noting that even she found herself losing focus listening to it. Head bowed, she offered an apology for bringing up such a heavy topic on what was meant to be a joyous occasion, her voice trailing before she could finish the thought. The dragon warned her plainly that she needed to steel herself for disappointment, its golden eyes fixed on her small frame in the dim cavern. An official announcement followed soon after. Lord Ferda now held the position of Fiang Fei, tasked with overseeing the Eastern Territory in her name. The weight of what that meant for humans hung unfinished in the air. A young man stood atop a balcony, arms outstretched to a cheering crowd below, showered in falling petals. It was the same shift in demeanor that had once overtaken the third prince, the instant he had claimed his own share of power. The dragon's eye narrowed slightly, saying nothing, watching the scene unfold with quiet judgment. She begged forgiveness for stirring up memories buried for decades, insisting it was still the best counsel she could offer. The dragon answered softly, admitting it understood her concern rather than resenting it. Under a pale moon and drifting clouds, the truth settled in. Mortals were beings destined to fade away eventually, their time always limited compared to those who lived far longer. The engagement ceremony drew to a close. A dark-haired man exhaled, standing frozen in place, as the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. He admitted to himself, still stunned, that he had truly become engaged to Valdrova. The whole situation felt impossible to grasp, more like a dream than reality. He thought back to the years he spent consumed entirely by hatred and rage, emotions so overwhelming that they left no space for anything softer to take root. A figure in red armor tilted her head slightly, a faint smile crossing her lips, radiant under the golden light surrounding her. He sat alone at the edge of the bed, shoulders hunched, hands clasped together as he processed how different this moment felt compared to everything he had known before. A close-up of his eye revealed a flicker of longing, the thought settling in that from that single moment onward, he wanted to relive it again and again, unwilling to let it fade like everything else eventually would. A red circle burned wild against Ferda's chest, spiraling out of control as he clutched at his own collar. Breath ragged, blood dripping from his lips, the pendant around his neck pulsed violently, threatening to consume him from within. Just what was this emotion tearing through him? A rampage of the circle threatened the caster with self-destruction. Yet if mastered, it could become the very key to growth. Standing at the edge of a forest overlooking a distant tower, he understood the risk was worth taking. If it was a peak he had already conquered once before, climbing it again would not prove difficult. He walked on, suitcase in hand, resolve settling into every step across the golden fields. What the circle demanded was mental willpower and mana. As a first circle mage, his reserves were still painfully thin, yet he stared at the crimson liquid swirling in the glass before him, knowing exactly what it represented. His mental willpower, once honed to the level of an archmage in another life, surged back to him now, overflowing far beyond what his current body could hold. Raging mana spun into a violent crimson vortex, and he refused to waste a single drop of it, guiding the chaos with practiced precision. Layer by layer he folded the swirling energy inward, forming the second circle. With this, he would take one step closer to her. Sunlight spilled over the spires of the academy the following morning, and a voice rang out in disbelief. Echoing off the towers, he had reached the second circle in just 3 days. Walking beside him through the stone corridors, his attendant marveled aloud at the pace of his progress, admitting she had wondered why his door had been locked for so long. She turned to him, eyes narrowing with quiet curiosity. Was this the usual rate of growth for Red Circle mages, or was something else happening? He answered without hesitation. It depended entirely on the person, not the circle itself. There was, however, a hidden cost to this kind of growth, one that came wrapped in warning, rather than celebration. He walked forward through soft light, and beneath his feet a thread of crimson bled downward into darkness, a quiet reminder of what fueled his ascent. With every new circle created, one had to chase after an even greater stimulation than before, feeding the hunger that came with power. He raised a hand toward the sky, surrounded by a rising tide of red, as if reaching for something just beyond his grasp. The most intense emotion, remembered by the circle, seeped into its caster, becoming a permanent part of who they were. Just as hatred had once shaped him in his past life, he had wandered afterward in search of things to hate. Even once his revenge had finally been settled, his attendant gestured toward the grand office before him, announcing this would now be his workspace as Lord Ferda, though he would act strictly under the Archduke's authority. Even here, in what was unmistakably a dragon's fortress, he could sense careful consideration for her fiancé woven into every corner of the room. To think all of this had been arranged for the sake of a mere human left him almost speechless, the weight of it settling somewhere deep in his chest. Seated at last behind the grand desk, hands folded together, he declared the beginning of his first duties as regent of the Archduke. Though the Valdrova royal territory had long sat neglected, practically abandoned since the Archduke's absence, yet ever since he had exposed Thessalos and hung him for his crimes, the territorial lords had learned to tread carefully whenever he was near. Managing the territory had grown far easier since Ruri began assisting him, her steady presence lightening the weight of paperwork that once consumed his every hour alone. Seated at his desk, Ferda decided the first step was sending letters to the lords he had met during his travels, marking this as his first official greeting since taking the regency. Ruri watched over his shoulder, curious what he intended to write. His eyes sharpened with quiet intent as he settled on the idea that he and these lords should begin meeting regularly from this point forward. He explained plainly that as regent, he would now be intervening directly in internal administration, and that any lord unhappy with this arrangement need not bother replying, a courtesy extended out of respect rather than an invitation to debate. He signed the letter simply as Ferda Valdrova, and the lords who received it reacted with a mixture of unease and quiet resignation, satisfied that this covered matters concerning the nobility. He moved on to the next problem weighing on the territory: the monsters plaguing the countryside. These were creatures that poisoned farmland simply by existing near it, leaving corpses scattered across fields where villagers had once worked in peace. Countless residents had lost their lives to these lesser threats, while Archduke Valdrova herself held back the disaster. Class giants that could level entire towns. There remained a limit to how many smaller monsters could be contained without dedicated manpower. Recognizing the gap, Ferda concluded that his first task would be recruiting the talent necessary to fill it, and he asked Ruri whether she already had anyone in mind for the role. Ruri held up a list of names for him to consider, though her expression carried a note of uncertainty as she watched his reaction. Reading down the list, he found unfamiliar names scrawled across the page, each one a mystery to him despite Ruri clearly having some plan in mind. Ruri asked whether this meant they would have to travel out and recruit their very first candidate in person, her tone suggesting she wasn't thrilled by the prospect. She admitted she found it strange that he would consider recruiting some unknown scholar, someone the world had never even heard of. As they made their way toward Escalrea, the city of scholars, its massive ancient tree towering over rooftops and canals below, she reasoned that it was only natural he wouldn't recognize the name, since the man in question was a talent who had never revealed his abilities publicly, and pulling random strangers off the street to serve as government officials could easily backfire. Ferda studied the list again, and Ruri pressed him further, half joking that he must have scribbled these names down without any real thought behind them. He countered that there was no way he had done something so careless, insisting it had taken considerable effort and time to gather the intelligence behind that very list. His gaze sharpened as an old memory surfaced, one tied directly to the origins of that list, and the person who had first created it. Long ago, that same list had served an entirely different purpose. It had been his kill list, compiled during the years he moved silently among scholars and nobles, gathering names of those he intended to destroy. Back then, he had dug into people's achievements, purely to find reasons to despise them, watching closely for any flaw or weakness he could later use as leverage for revenge. It had been a list born entirely from hatred, one he had built during the days when he hunted indiscriminately for anything or anyone worth resenting. Looking back on it now, he recognized how much of that obsession had simply been paranoia. Sitting beside Ruri near the statue of a renowned scholar in the city square, his only real problem now was figuring out how to locate the man he actually needed to find among such a crowded place. While nearby, a street vendor loudly hawked skewers of fruit, calling out to nobles and cheerful passers-by to try his sweets as a cure for their troubles. Ferda pressed the vendor further, asking whether many academy graduates passed through this part of the city. The old man laughed, insisting that despite his rough appearance, he had run his stall here for years and knew the area well. Taking that as confirmation, Ferda asked whether the vendor had heard of a scholar known locally by an unflattering nickname tied to sloppiness and disorder. The vendor repeated the word back in confusion. Then Ruri cut in sharply, accusing Ferda of planning to turn their own castle into chaos, with whoever this person turned out to be. The vendor quickly recovered, laughing that the nickname was indeed well known around these parts. Admitting his memory of faces blurred easily after years of running his stall, the vendor trailed off, distracted by the skewers of glistening fruit dangling before him as Ferda asked the price. Before he could finish naming a fair price, Ruri interrupted, declaring that a single skewer would never be enough, and that they would be taking all three instead. The vendor happily handed them over, and Ruri stood beaming with satisfaction, kiwi and strawberry skewers gleaming in her grip. Ferda watched her devour them eagerly, silently amused at how unexpectedly delighted she seemed over something so simple. Ruri, catching his stare, snapped back defensively that of course she liked them, insisting this was merely proper payment for information rendered. He found himself wondering whether her emotions had dulled the same way his own once had, only to realize she was still fully capable of an expression as unguarded and childlike as this. Standing beside her afterward, he fell silent, watching her happily finish another bite before turning to offer him one of the remaining skewers. She extended it toward him, mentioning almost shyly that he was welcome to eat the rest if he wanted. With the sky beginning to dim overhead, she urged him to move quickly before nightfall caught them still wandering the streets. Elsewhere, deep within a candlelit room, a scholar warned that they risked losing the right opportunity if they waited any longer. The timing simply too fragile to ignore. A crash rang out through the chamber, as scrolls and papers scattered violently across the floor, knocking the scholar down amid the wreckage of his own research. He cried out in pain, his glasses askew, tears welling as he realized the full extent of the disaster. Everything he had spent so long gathering had just been destroyed in an instant, scattered beyond recovery across the ruined floor. Graduation day at Veritas Academy marked the end of a long and turbulent journey for Burnell Marquis, a name whispered with equal parts admiration and dread. He had entered as the top student of his class, only to leave with a reputation as the biggest troublemaker the school had ever produced. Dressed in his ceremonial robe and cap, he turned at the sound of his name. The men greeting him carried none of the warmth their words suggested. One of them mocked the title stitched onto his diploma, calling him messy, and questioning just how badly he must have behaved to earn it. Despite the sarcastic congratulations, their smiles held something colder underneath, a warning disguised as celebration. Once the crowd thinned, the friendly mask disappeared entirely. The leader leaned close, his grin sharp and predatory, asking Burnell whether it was finally time to settle what he owed. The cheerful noise of graduation faded into something far more threatening. Sweat rolled down Burnell's face as reality set in. Behind his forced laughter sat a truth he couldn't escape. Every asset to his name existed only as debt, stacked higher than any achievement he had earned at the academy. A fist slammed against wood, the impact echoing through the room. A voice demanded to know exactly when he intended to pay back what he owed, each word dripping with impatience and barely restrained anger. Burnell dropped to his knees, pleading for more time as rough hands seized his collar. The men surrounding him had waited years for this moment, and his request only deepened their fury, one snapping that he must have lost his mind to ask for further delay. Disgust twisted the leader's face as he noticed the remains scattered nearby, complaining loudly about the foul stench. Someone quickly corrected him, insisting that what lay before them wasn't some ordinary animal but the corpse of a monster. Eager to justify himself, Burnell launched into an explanation of his work, describing how he sought to recycle useless monster remains into mana stones and usable power sources. He believed the research could benefit the entire continent, though his enthusiasm was met with nothing but a dismissive scoff. The leader reminded him coldly that years of patience had been spent waiting for this so-called groundbreaking research to pay off. He pressed further, demanding to know if the project generated any income at all right now. Burnell could only admit that it currently didn't, citing too many unresolved variables standing in the way. A long sigh followed, the man taking a slow drag from his cigar before commenting on how little Burnell understood about the way the world truly operated. Scholarly ideals meant nothing against unpaid debt. A knife clicked open in his hand as he offered a way out, promising to forgive the debt if Burnell abandoned his current research altogether. Confusion flashed across Burnell's face at the sudden proposal. The man explained that weapon development brought massive profits no matter where you looked, suggesting Burnell redirect his intelligence toward something more lucrative. He recalled hearing that Burnell had once been the top student during his first year, implying his talent was being wasted. Burnell's grip tightened on his papers as the blade glinted before him. Nervous laughter escaped his lips before he stammered out a request to instead pursue a different research proposal entirely. The knife swung down suddenly, cutting through the air with a sharp, violent motion that promised no patience remained for further negotiation. Frustration boiled over as the leader accused him of being deliberately difficult, despite every attempt at reasoning. Burnell fell silent, trembling under the weight of the situation, before finally forcing out a weak protest, insisting there had to be another way. Desperation cracked his voice as he shouted that he absolutely could not develop weapons under any circumstance, begging instead for a different kind of experiment to work on. The leader's expression hardened completely, declaring that words clearly held no effect on him anymore. A violent kick followed instantly, sending Burnell crashing backward without warning. Blow after blow rained down as the men surrounded him, shouting that refusing every offer left him no room for mercy. They reminded him coldly that loan sharks valued every single penny, and his stubbornness would cost him dearly. Pain blurred his vision as he curled up, terrified of a strike aimed at his head. Between groans, a single thought repeated in his mind: at this rate, he was truly going to die. A cold command cut through the chaos, ordering an end to the beating before it went any further. Burnell lay bruised against the ground, barely able to lift his head as the violence around him abruptly stopped. Footsteps approached from outside, drawn by the disturbing noise echoing through the walls. A figure paused at the entrance, a young woman trailing close behind, before speaking with quiet certainty that he had found the right place. The stranger's expression remained calm despite the scene before him. He revealed that he too had matters to settle with the same man being punished, his tone carrying an authority that made the loan sharks pause. Judging by his fine clothing, one of the men assumed he was some wealthy young master passing through town. Suspicion quickly followed, as he asked bluntly whether Burnell had borrowed money from this newcomer as well. The stranger denied it flatly, offering instead to wait his turn. He added dismissively that he would only rough up Burnell enough to keep him conscious, just enough for the man to still speak afterward. A sharp glance flicked toward Burnell's crumpled form, and a quiet remark followed, hinting that letting the beating continue any further would create complications neither side wanted. Burnell lay motionless on the ground, listening as the stranger clarified his true purpose. What mattered to him wasn't Burnell's voice, but the intellect inside his skull, the very thing his research depended on. Stepping forward with calculated confidence, the stranger proposed a new arrangement, offering to settle Burnell's entire debt himself instead of letting the beating continue. The loan shark's eyes narrowed as he named the total sum, informing him that with interest included, the debt had ballooned to a staggering 72 golden coins, then challenged whether he truly had the means to cover it. Without hesitation, a simple answer came in response. Behind him, a maid moved swiftly, slamming a heavy sack onto the table with enough force to make its contents jingle loudly. Gold coins spilled into view, gleaming under the dim light. Stunned, the loan shark stammered out a shaky exclamation, clearly not expecting such casual wealth from a stranger who had simply wandered in. Bitterness crept into his voice as he addressed Burnell directly, remarking sarcastically on his sudden fortune in finding such a wealthy backer, calling him lucky despite everything that had just happened to him. Greedy fingers dug into the pile of coins, confirming under his breath that this payment finally cleared the troublesome debt Burnell had carried for years. Before he could pull the money away completely, a firm voice interrupted, telling him to hold on and wait just a moment longer. The stranger reminded him that their transaction wasn't finished yet, questioning sharply why his hands were already reaching for something that wasn't fully his. Shock flickered across the loan shark's face at the unexpected pushback. Anger flared instantly, the man demanding to know what this sudden change of terms was supposed to mean, unwilling to accept any shift after the deal seemed already settled in his favor. Calmly, the stranger explained that his original request had been for the man's brain, not his cooperation through violence. Given how badly Burnell had been beaten, he doubted the research capabilities he needed would still function properly, leaving Burnell silent and tense beside him. He pressed further, insisting that damaging merchandise before a deal closed meant compensation was owed, treating Burnell's battered condition as a broken product rather than a person. Outraged by the comparison, the loan shark shouted back, demanding to know what twisted logic allowed someone to speak about a person that way, desperately trying to pull free from a growing grip on his wrist. A sudden cry of pain rang out as pressure snapped down on his wrist, silencing his protest instantly, while the stranger turned calmly to the maid beside him, entrusting the rest of the punishment to her without a hint of hesitation. A flash of green light surged from the maid's palm, striking the loan sharks with unstoppable force. Their bodies crumpled backward, sent skidding across the floor as the raw pressure of her power tore through the room. One man's face pressed against the ground, his mind racing in confusion, questioning whether some kind of magic had frozen his limbs in place. A voice cut through his panic, informing him that two choices now lay before him. The stranger laid out the terms coldly, demanding either the settlement money to cover Burnell's injuries or an equivalent beating in return, adding with quiet mockery that loan sharks valued every single penny. A dark certainty settled over the scene as the stranger predicted the men would choose violence over payment without hesitation, and true enough, the leader's face twisted with dread as the shadow loomed closer. The maid's voice rang out calmly, declaring that a fair share of beatings would settle the compensation, her hands glowing with energy as the men beneath her trembled in anticipation of what came next. Screams tore through the alley, echoing across the quiet street outside as the sounds of retribution rang through the building's walls. Once the ordeal ended, Burnell limped forward to face his rescuers properly, gratitude shining in his tired expression as he struggled to find the right words for what had just happened. Bowing slightly, he thanked the stranger for saving his life, admitting he had no idea how he could ever repay such an enormous favor. Composing himself despite his disheveled appearance, he introduced himself properly as Burnell Marquis, known among his peers as the Messy Scholar, then asked politely for his rescuer's name in return. The stranger answered simply, giving his name as Ferda Valdrova, a name that made Burnell's eyes widen in shock and disbelief. Burnell immediately dropped into a deep bow, apologizing frantically for failing to recognize the Archduke's consort, while Ferda brushed off the mistake, telling him it was only natural he hadn't known. Still lying on the ground from exhaustion, Burnell listened as Ferda explained the true reason behind his visit, revealing that he had come specifically because he'd seen Burnell's research. Startled by the admission, Burnell questioned whether someone of such high status could truly be interested in his work, unable to hide his disbelief at the sudden attention. Ferda confirmed it plainly, extending an open hand as he explained that he had heard about Burnell's efforts to find practical uses for monster corpses, noting that the Far East suffered from an overwhelming monster population. Overcome with emotion, Burnell clasped his hands together as Ferda offered him unconditional support for his research if he agreed to relocate to Valdrova Castle, the words striking him like a dream come true. Ferda promised to provide everything necessary, materials, funding and facilities, without asking a single question about the nature of the work, a generosity that left onlookers quietly wondering if he had fully thought this through. Just as Burnell's excitement peaked, Ferda added a condition to the offer, stating plainly that the research would eventually need to produce weapons. Burnell's expression shifted instantly, his voice firm as he explained that he could not accept those terms, insisting that weapons only brought death and destruction to a world he wanted to remain peaceful. Ferda studied him for a long moment before responding, calling him a lover of peace, though his tone carried a weight that suggested the conversation was far from finished. He pressed further, describing the monsters Burnell intended to study as creatures capable of slaughtering countless people across the Far East, then revealed the staggering scale of the threat. Colossal monsters emerging every 3 days, forces powerful enough to erase an entire city like Esculria in a single strike, forcing the Archduke himself to march to the front lines again and again. Ferda described her without naming her outright, explaining that each time the threat emerged, the Archduke charged into the vanguard herself, risking her own life against monsters capable of leveling entire cities. His gaze hardened as he spoke of those who lived comfortably within the empire, unaware that their peace stood entirely on her sacrifices, oblivious as they carried on with ordinary lives while she bled for them in silence. He explained the reason behind his search, admitting he needed someone capable of crafting weapons to aid her efforts, someone whose work could finally ease the crushing burden she carried alone. Holding out a sealed scroll, Ferda declared plainly that this was exactly why he had come seeking Burnell, offering the position of chief researcher to a man everyone else in the academic world dismissed and ridiculed. A wax seal pressed firmly against the letter of appointment, and Burnell stared down at it in stunned silence as the weight of the offer settled over him, his own name printed clearly beneath the title of the messy scholar. Doubt crept into his expression despite the honor before him, his hands trembling slightly as he admitted that actually building weapons with his own hands still felt like a difficult line to cross, even knowing the reasoning behind it. A vision of the future flickered through the narrative, showing a lone figure standing amid ruins and shattered trees, revealing that the man before them would one day become someone willing to wage war himself, all in the name of protecting the peace he once refused to compromise.